let's just talk about from a bird's eye view the year you had in 2021. I mean, in some ways, people feel, even people in crypto, that FTX and you kind of came out of nowhere. I'm sure it doesn't feel that way for you, but insane growth. Would you say that 2021 has been the biggest year you've had? And what are your high-level takeaways? What were the highlights for you?
Certainly it's been the biggest year that we've had. And I guess every year has felt like the biggest year that we've had when it happened. But this certainly more so than the ones before it. I don't think it felt to us completely like it came out of nowhere, partially just because I think a lot of it was flowing from things that we had done before, and that just sort of took some time to percolate through the system. But I mean, our volume is up, probably like 30x or so in the last year. And it's really been a sea change for the platform. So it's been really cool to watch. And some of that is just the growth of the industry overall. But some of them, some of that's also been idiosyncratic FTX growth, which has been super cool.
Neat, Sam. I'd love to jump in. It's Jeff here. I'm curious, what's it been like for you on a personal level? Because, you've gone from sort of being, Sam to SPF, crypto celebrity. And I'm just wondering, what's that like? I mean, it's got to be pretty cool in some respects, but is there drawbacks? Like, has it changed you? So what's it like being famous?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's mostly doesn't impact my life very much, but some of that's because, I mean, mostly I'm working, right? Like, and as long as I'm working, things are mostly the same, internally. But it's certainly like, I don't know, there are a lot of people coming out of the woodwork who I sort of haven't, spoken to in a very long time. There's been that. And so, around the edges, you can start to see some real impact of it. Although, by and large, I think things are mostly as they have been. But I think, bit by bit, day by day, at least sort of outwards facing parts of my life have changed a little bit.
Like when you walk down the street, do people know who you are, or?
Like, not never, but like not usually. I think it's sort of like, I don't know, probably happens to me, like once a week or something right now. So enough that I sort of like have taken note of it, but not enough that it's like, really impacting my routine.
Okay, so you've kind of hit the sweet spot of celebrity then. You get to kind of be known and be rich and popular, but you also get to be left alone most of the time.
For now, I suspect I don't have a whole lot of say on exactly where that ends up on that balance.
Well, Sam, it's fun to kind of get inside baseball, meta, media. So just sticking with this, I mean, do you enjoy doing this, talking to journalists like us? I mean, do you enjoy the media part? Because not every crypto exec does. Many will never talk to us, and we kind of appreciate how available you are.
Yeah, I do kind of enjoy it. And I think a big part of that is just thinking of it to myself as just talking about stuff, about my life, about, my work, and about the things that I've been thinking about, rather than thinking of it as like PR or something like that. Because if you think of it as PR, then it's sort of, it's not just like a chore, but it's sort of like a kind of nerve-wracking chore. I mean, you're kind of sitting there the whole time, being like, oh boy, please don't fuck up, please don't fuck up, please don't fuck up. But if you think about it, it's just like, whatever, like just chatting about the stuff that I'm into. It's just like, I don't know, it's kind of interesting. And I think that obviously, being a reporter in the space selects for having a lot of interesting things that you're thinking about. And so overall, I do think I kind of enjoy it.
Yeah, Sam, we'll move on to like the crypto stuff in a minute, but if you don't mind, I'd just like to ask a couple more sort of more personal questions, just because you're suddenly everywhere and people like to know kind of, it's a funny thing. I've interviewed executives for a long time, and as they get further along, they sort of clean up the story and there becomes like the official narrative, but, it sort of becomes a rigid biography, the sort of the party line, but, you're still sort of seem to be very open to, discussing honestly about who you are, where you came from. So tell us a little bit about yourself, like, in high school or college before you became SPF crypto star. Who were you? What did you like? What were you into?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense in which I was very similar. And I think that sense is the one in which um, I thought similarly in a lot of ways. I, but I sort of just didn't, I don't know, I didn't do anything about it. I, I was very, I don't know, lame is almost the word I think I used. I sort of didn't say anything or do anything. Is like how I conceive of myself. And I think like certainly going back to you know, middle school, like whenever I think about it, I just get like very, very confused about how I managed to fill up 24 hours in a day. It just seems like implausible to me, given what I was doing, that you know, that all those hours were filled and somehow it's like I can only name like 13 hours worth, even if you include sleep. So, um, I don't know. I was not. I think I was never really that into being a kid, even as a kid. It just wasn't I think what I was excited about. And I think that got a lot better, when I sort of got into to college. But I don't know. I was nerdy. I was sort of into math and physics and um like playing games. But I like hadn't really thought about what I wanted to do with my life in any meaningful sense.
Did you read much sci-fi, Sam? Like nowadays with the metaverse and everything, I feel like people are rediscovering Snow Crash and Cryptonomicon, Neuromancer, things like that. You're a reader?
Well, I was a reader until I was like 8. Um, and then I had to start reading for school, and I absolutely fucking hated it. And I actually just stopped reading entirely. Like not just for school, but in all ways. Um, School definitely ruined reading for me. Is there no question about that? And it's maybe it's a little sad. I mean, I certainly think in retrospect that a big part of this is like it just isn't the medium that I like. I think I like shorter form more. I think very few people I think very few people have like 500 pages worth of things that it makes sense for them to say. Like I think usually by page 500 it's sort of a stretch. But I but I mean some people do, and maybe it's a little sad that I sort of have lost some of that. I don't know.
More comfortable on Twitter.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that is like a medium that I just feel. I mean, I think sometimes it's too short, and like people just like can't even get out like a real coherent thought. Um, but I think that it forces people. I think sometimes it's good to force people to be really concise.
Yeah. Yeah.
Turning to when you got into crypto, Sam, one thing I find somewhat refreshing about you is, talk to these crypto founders, and usually they're right away, falling over themselves to say how they're doing it to change the world and they're going to, improve people's lives and spread democracy and stuff, which is all great. And, maybe you want to do that too, don't we all? But, often they're just the most interested in getting very rich quickly. So I'm kind of curious, like how did you get the bug? Was it just the rush of making a lot of money? Was it the technology? What pulled you in?
Yeah, I mean, at the very beginning, it was absolutely, something that I saw as a way to make money. Um, when I first got involved in crypto, this was late 2017, I was coming at it from the perspective of like, these markets seem really inefficient. And, that makes me think there's a trade to do here. Um, and that, if I did this right, maybe I could make money doing that. That was where it came from. And it ultimately sort of evolved into much more than that. But I didn't really know what a Bitcoin was when I first got into crypto. And said my ultimate goal was just to be able to donate whatever I could. And I'd been doing that on Wall Street, and it seemed like maybe there was a good opportunity to do that. I don't know, there's Wall Street, there's Main Street. Is there Crypto Street? Is there like a Bit Street?
Crypto Alley. Yeah.
Crypto Alley, yeah.
It's probably Union Square, New York. Which, by the way, you mentioned to Congress that you're no longer in Hong Kong. Where are you living these days? Tell us about the move.
Yeah, so I'm in the Bahamas now, and it's really nice here. I'm happy to be here. I think it's a great place for us to be for just a number of reasons. I think like one piece of this is, I mean, the biggest piece is just regulatory. There is an actual regulatory framework for crypto in the Bahamas, and that describes very few places on Earth right now. Almost every place is currently in, basically a state of disarray and uncertainty, and that will change over time, but that's where we are today, and I that's not ideal. Um, so I that's by far the biggest thing. Outside of that, like really, I mean, it's super conveniently located, no quarantine. That I mean, that I whatever. It's a wild, fucked up world we live in, but in this wild, fucked up world, that's one of the things that matters the most, I guess, is like, are you even able to get like into a place and out of it? Is that legal? And it's a little weird. That's the world we're in, but it is the world we're in. And so that's another great thing about the Bahamas. And then it's a great place to live, and we've been able to hire a lot of people we're really excited about here.
Fair enough on getting in and out, but you were in Washington, D.C. recently, and I'm curious, what was that like? I mean, it's still kind of got to be a big deal to walk into Capitol Hill, and were you like sort of, feeling like, patriotic and awed, or were you just sort of bored, or what was that experience like?
Oh, I think it always feels a little bit patriotic. I think that's an appropriate word. I think maybe more so than younger me would have expected. I think I sort of like would maybe have expected that whatever that serves some sentimental feeling, it's not super relevant here or something like that. But I do feel it, and I guess that like it's very I mean, it's been really interesting being at the forefront of crypto regulatory thought. And actually getting to see sort of each part of this process work up close. A lot of it isn't maybe how I thought it would be. And I mean, whatever, the world is weird and contingent in so many ways. And every year I decide the world is a little bit weirder and a little bit more contingent than I thought it was the year before. But that's like certainly the case in the crypto regulatory ecosystem right now. That it's very much sort of balanced on a knife's edge in a lot of places in a lot of ways. And a lot of ways that I think are like super interesting. And are going to have really profound impacts on the ecosystem. I think, my biggest takeaway from testifying was that it was really productive and reasonable. And that was sort of like, there are a lot of reasons not to expect that was going to be the takeaway, but I think it was. And I think that like, I really did just get the sense of like, there were a lot of representatives there, most of whose aim seemed to be like, figure out what was going on in crypto, ask questions which would help them get there. Rather than like, they had their point they wanted to make and they were going to make that point.
Yeah, I confess I was pleasantly surprised because I've watched these before, and it's usually just kind of people strutting for YouTube and getting like the dunk clip. So I thought it was going to be one of those. But I was very impressed at the sort of thoughtfulness and the preparedness of our members of Congress, go figure, with one or two exceptions.
Yeah.
But that said, we published a column recently on Dems are blowing the Bitcoin vote, which I think is the case. I just, because we saw a lot of young Democrats that hearing asking very good questions, even the progressives. And yet the party is dominated in terms of crypto policy by Elizabeth Warren, Gary Gensler, Janet Yellen, that crew. And I'm kind of curious, you were Joe Biden's biggest donor. Do you think the Democrats are making a mistake, the senior leadership, by taking the approaches they are? And have you shifted your sort of, inclinations for who you're going to give money to next cycle?
So, yeah, it's a bunch of things there to unpack. The first thing that I'll say, and probably the most important thing, is like, obviously this is what I do with my life, is work in the digital asset ecosystem, and it's incredibly important to me. I'm fortunate to be in a position where it's what is incredibly important to me because my life is, I'm privileged. We're all privileged in a lot of ways. There are a lot of things that are really important in the world that don't look like this to a lot of people. And so I think that's like one really big and important piece of context is like when it comes to sort of my giving in the space, like a lot of that has nothing to do with any of this. Like a lot of that is coming from the perspective of what of like what can I do to try and help out the world, completely putting aside where I in particular am coming from. So I putting that aside for a sec, I think that there is certainly a risk for the Democrats that they sort of blow the crypto vote, so to speak. I think, and again, I think the hearing made me feel a lot better about it. Like it made me feel a lot more like it seemed like they're approaching it from an eminently reasonable perspective, coming from an angle of again inquisitiveness, and trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. And so I definitely don't think that like anything has been written down yet, written in stone yet, in terms of how this is going to turn out. And I remain like, I don't know if remain's even quite the right word, because I think I've become cautiously a bit more optimistic over time about this, that it is going to end up in a reasonable position, and I think the hearing was a good example of that. And I think that like even the players who I think are often seen as monolithic in their approach often aren't. I think that like there's a completely reasonable tendency to treat basically treat people as their caricatures, and sometimes people are their caricatures. Like I'm not going to tell you that's never correct, but I think often it's not. I think often the real truth is actually substantially more nuanced than that, and that their caricatures do not do justice to where they're actually coming from here. And so I think that is very much going on in this particular case. And that's just very much the case, that like most of the people are coming at this from, I think, a much healthier position than is generally believed. And that the things that seem sort of caricature-ish to people often, I don't know, it's a weird corner of what's going on, or something. It's not representative of the larger whole, and that more generally, they do have kind of reasonable goals. And I'm not going to say that's true of everyone, but I think it's true of some people that you mentioned, for instance. And I think that like a lot of people might have done some pattern matching. I think I might treat myself as guilty of this. And guess that like AOC was going to come out bomb throwing in the congressional hearing. Like I think that would be kind of like if you saw that title, that headline, I think you'd be like, yeah, maybe it would be more of a headline if that didn't happen or something, right? But in fact, like she had, I think, one of the most informed, one of the most interesting lines of questioning. She was really sharp, really responsive. I think like kind of knocked it out of the park on that, in a way which was not, didn't particularly feel like it was, pro crypto or anti crypto. It was just sort of, and so I think that like that we sometimes do a disservice by writing people off too quickly.
Well, and you're certainly right that one particularly vitriolic soundbite can become amplified. Elizabeth Warren comes out and says crypto is shadowy supercoders, and that gets amplified across the landscape. That's true. You make a good point about the caricatures. Sam, if we stick with regulation but go beyond just like political party and go global, I mean, especially because, you know, part of the reason you're in the Bahamas, what do you think of the people, and there are many in crypto, a lot of them OGs, you know, Eric Voorhees of Shapeshift and others, who just say the US has kind of already blown it. Companies and projects and protocols are going to leave the US. You know, it's like something I say to people is the ICO boom didn't really end. I mean, you still have new token launches all the time, but a lot of them just say, well, forget the US then. You know, we'll just launch them outside the US to avoid. Is there hope, you know, for kind of the US establishing a more friendly landscape? Because a lot of people are kind of already, they feel like they've already closed the book on the US being a good place to build in crypto.
Well, I think I'd flip that around a little bit, like, especially in terms of the tenses, right? Like, you're saying, like, are people already going to start leaving the US because of the regulatory framework? I think it's the opposite. I think for the last 4 years, most of crypto has been going on offshore because of the regulatory framework. Like, this isn't a new thing. This has been true. This is, in fact, really central to the nature of the crypto ecosystem today. And if you look at, I mean, what fraction of volume, and you can just look up numbers from today, you know, what fraction of volume today is happening on US exchanges? You know, I'm seeing out of $172 billion or so of volume, I'm seeing less than 10 of that coming from the United States. So, you know, 5%, 95% offshore. 5% is not the United States, you know, general fraction of economic activity. I think like 30% is maybe what you would guess, right? So this just has been the nature of the crypto ecosystem for at least the last 5 years. I'm like cautiously optimistic, and I do want to emphasize the cautiously there, that the movement might actually be in the opposite direction, that the movement might actually be onshore. I don't think you see that right now. I don't think you're seeing onshore movement. And it's for the same regulatory reasons that you haven't seen it, right? Like every other asset class, the majority of volume is in futures. And there are only 6 players in the United States licensed to offer futures contracts. And most of them are not interested in crypto, or at least have not historically been. I think a lot of a lot has been written on the question of what categorization digital assets fall into, whether some are securities, if so, which ones? Well, certainly some are. You know, and I think that like, that's I don't want to say that that's like been miraculously fixed overnight. What I would say though is, like, I would not be shocked if massive progress was made on that in the next year or two, to the point where you know, you might see a tripling of the fraction of liquidity and volume that was onshore. And you know, I think that's probably our single biggest priority right now, is to see if we can help bring that about. So yeah, I think things are in some sense way worse than that, you know, implied. But I also think maybe things are getting better.
Well, Sam, speaking about onshore, one thing that's definitely onshore, even if most of crypto not, is crypto companies, including your logo, all over Major League Baseball and sports, and other people are jumping in too. But I find a bit of like a paradox here, in the sense that I dabble in crypto just so I know what's going on, but one thing I don't do is trade derivatives or futures. And you know why? Like, I look at it like flying an airplane. That's something like you only do if you really know what you're doing, because if not, you're just going to get eaten. And I think most Americans, most people don't trade futures contracts. And yet FTX is having such an outside presence. Is that going to change? Like, do you have aspirations to kind of bring crypto to the everyman who's not out there like slinging puts and calls?
Yeah. So, you know, internationally right now, the bulk of our volume is futures and derivatives. And as you sort of, you know, guess would be the case, given that internationally right now, the bulk of our volume is power users. You know, the vast majority of the trading volume is coming from sophisticated users of the platform, whether they're institutions or whether they're you know, professional traders. The crypto ecosystem in the United States has been sort of deprived of that piece. And so instead what we've had is the retail phenomenon, right? That Coinbase, Robinhood, and others have really come to signify. And that's something that we are hoping to be able to get much more involved in over time, and that we're hoping to to be able to leave our marks in. But it's going to take a lot of work, I think, for us to get there. I think we have a lot to offer this space. I think, lower fees, new technology, and disintermediating everything. I'm super excited about it. When you look at first of all, when you look at the branding that we've been doing in the US aimed at Americans, that's for FTX US, which doesn't offer derivatives. And so that is much more on the kind of retail consumer side. By the same note, though, the primary goal of it thus far hasn't been conversions, so to speak. It hasn't been, let's try to get everyone to like do a lot of trade and like sign up, which is interesting. It's sort of like, I don't know, in some sense, like, well, what else would you be doing if not that?
Right. Yeah.
Right. And the answer is actually a lot. And who are the people that we're thinking about with the branding campaigns? Like, rewinding to where we are, we've been product first and we're not name brand first, right? We have 3 times Coinbase's daily trading volume. They have 25 times our registered user count. They've done absolutely phenomenal in terms of getting their name out there and being a trusted brand in the United States. If we just go spam Facebook right now with ads, right? People are like, oh, great, another scammy crypto ad. That's not exciting, right? Before that would even make sense, we have to tell stories about who we are, both to potential users, also to institutional partners. And so that's much more how we're thinking about, the partnerships.
Well, and Sam, let's drill down on that just a little more. I mean, I have a particular interest in sports business. When we spoke at the SALT conference in New York, I asked you about this and whether you are yet seeing data showing the success of the sports marketing. And it's interesting what you just said about, we're not necessarily going for conversions. But of course, you do the Miami Heat arena and you get your patch on every MLB ump. It's obviously going to suddenly become more of a name than before, not even to mention the TV ads with, the Moon Man, the Brady stuff. And so I guess I'd ask, whether you would already say it's been a hit and whether the spend makes sense. And I'll share with you that someone from a different rival exchange recently was trying to say, and of course, take it at, whatever value you take it at, but, oh, that's not our approach. We're not going to do the FTX and crypto.com thing of just throwing a bunch of money into sports. I mean, what would you say to the sort of skeptics who think that that's not the right marketing approach?
Well, first of all, may the best man win. I mean, maybe we're wrong, right? That's fine. I think it's more interesting if we disagree on the right approach. But okay, more seriously, I think that if you measure it by, something like downloads per dollar spent on advertising, it's not going to come out well. Like it isn't going to look good by that metric. That's not the metric that it's aiming to look good by. It's aiming to look good by a different metric. And what's the most compelling evidence that I can bring about the impact that it's had on our business? There are some statistics we have, but let me actually, I think, go with maybe a much more direct response. In the last 5 minutes, new evidence has been brought to my attention that this has had a really big impact. And that evidence is you deciding it was important to ask me about it. Right? Like, you're an example of a person for whom clearly this was effective.
That's interesting. I mean, I knew FTX already, but it's reached a sort of saturation point.
So just,
yeah.
But if you sort of like rewind to like yourself, but who knew us less well, right? And it's not just you, like everyone we talk to who knows us a little bit, a lot, barely, intimately, this is top of mind for them. Like, clearly this has penetrated more than everything else we've done combined, in terms of people's perception of us. Not in terms of installs per dollar spent though, right? And so if that's what you're maximizing for, I don't necessarily want to vouch for it.
It's anecdata.
But that's sort of how it
Yeah, it's anecdata.
Yeah.
You feel like.
Yeah.
What about specifically esports? That's one I'm a little more skeptical of. I mean, you're a big esports believer. You guys are sponsoring a team. How has that done versus, something like MLB or having Tom Brady in ads is arguably a lot more mainstream?
Yeah, and I think that on the one hand, I think that's like absolutely correct, and that the amount of brand impact has been much bigger from the esports side than it has, from the from the not esports side,
right,
traditional sports side. The flip side of that, I guess, I would say, is that again, it's a different audience, and to some audience, not to most, but to some audience, it's like the most impactful thing in the world. So it's a much more targeted thing at a particular audience that we think there's high overlap with. But that's not the be all and end all. And it's sort of like some of the metrics are shockingly high there by some metrics. But again, this is a weird thing because this almost isn't a metrics driven thing in some ways. So I don't know. I think that one's a little bit in between in terms of what it's accomplishing.
Yeah, Sam, I'd love to jump in for 1 sec and ask, I'd love to comment. Someone was tweeting during your congressional hearing. This is the first time they've seen you doing something without also playing League of Legends at the same time. So are you playing League of Legends right now?
I will narrowly answer your question and confirm that I'm not playing League of Legends right now.
You're playing something else, okay? But just out of curiosity, you're splashing your logo on every big sports team. Are you actually a sports fan yourself, or is this just sort of like an experiment, or why MLB, why basketball?
Yeah, so I am sort of a sports fan, more so than to a decent extent. I am. I like having things going on in the background is a big piece of this. I really enjoy that. And I find it really stimulating, and I generally find it pretty difficult to not multitask. Like it kind of, I don't know, really grates on me. So I will often have a few. I mean, on Sunday I'll usually have a few games up at once in the background.
Yeah, we'll pivot to coins in just a sec. But so, who are your favorite sports teams? You're a Bay Area guy, right? So, are you sort of a SF Giants fan, or who's your teams?
Yeah, Giants were my hometown team growing up, and baseball was the sport that I watched the most when I was young. I now watch, in addition, a fair bit of football and sometimes basketball. In terms of football, I guess I'll just note that I sort of matured in the Boston area at college, and that had substantial impact on my football following.
Well, Dan's going to like that. I'll give it to you here, Dan.
Yeah, I'm a Boston guy too. I was actually just going to ask you for fun, Sam, if you have struck up a real life friendship with Tom Brady through all this.
He's a really cool guy. I mean, I haven't spent that much time talking to him, but I mean, that was a big thing for us, was like, does this feel legit? Like, does this feel to us like this person's going to be excited about this partnership? And with him, it just definitely did. And with a lot of people, you get a sense like, look, I mean, they think it's fine. They're not like rebelling against it, but it's not like that's what they're here for or anything like that. Like, it was, it's very much just a gig for them. But it was clearly more than that for him. And so I think that was pretty meaningful to us.
Okay, yeah, we should be talking some more pure crypto here. Obviously, this year, one of the big events was the rise of Solana, which, is kind of, burst in as the closest thing to a real Ethereum challenger we've seen. But I'm curious, just kind of at the macro level in the next couple of years, what you're seeing. As a reporter, I'm sort of not puzzled, but there's so many chains, I just wonder if there's room. Do they all have a lane? Avalanche has had a great year. Solana's a force, and then there's Cardano, which I think is, in my opinion, a pretender. But point being, there's sort of like 10 or 15 of these chains. They're all saying they're going to be it. Is it going to be like a Darwinian thing where there's only going to be like 3 left at the end, or is it kind of like a kumbaya thing where everyone's going to have a lane and all the coins will be happy?
Yeah. There's a sort of the answer you're supposed to give here, I think, which is the kumbaya answer, right? That's I think that's the current sort of like proper answer or something like that. I don't know. I think. Yeah, there's some extent to which that's true, but I think there's a meaningful extent to which I'm not convinced that we're going to have a billion chains with real activity long term. I'm not convinced that it makes sense for us to. I sort of think that that what I would guess would be we'd end up in a world where it's more like, each chain has to justify itself. It has to justify why people would choose to use it, especially if they're already using some other chain for something else, and so I think we're going to end up with more than one chain from that. But I don't know that we're going to end up with 100 actively used chains. I don't know that we're going to end up with 10 actively used chains. I think it might be fairly narrow from some perspective.
Well, very quickly, give us 3 besides Bitcoin and Ethereum, the 3 most promising blockchains for the coming 2 years.
Oh boy. And obviously, you've already touched on some of them, right? Like obviously Solana is going to be on my list there. And I do think I'm super excited for it. I think that it has, done something that very few other chains I think have even thought about trying to do, which is scale. I think that most chains that I look at, I just don't get the sense that scaling is anywhere on their roadmap. At least not really. That it's just sort of mostly an afterthought for them. And I think Solana has taken it extremely seriously. And I think they're one of the only chains that has a real plausible path forward here to scaling to the level you would need to get to if you wanted industrial scale usage. So okay, so that's certainly one that would be on the list. What else would be here? Well, I think Avalanche it's a real chain. It's a cool chain. The team knows their shit, and has been putting a ton of work into it. And I think they've prioritized maybe different things than I would naturally have done, but I'm not sure they're wrong. And that's not to say that I know best and they don't. They may be right in the end about what to prioritize. But I think that scaling has been less of what they've been looking at than, I would naively have expected. But I do think that it is a real chain. I think it's a cool chain, and I think that there's a world in which it gets absolutely huge. So
that's 2: Solana, Avalanche, and
yeah, and then 3. So, well, one question is how you feel about side chains, layer 2s, things like that. I think that wrappers are in general probably going to just keep growing over time, right? As you have a divergence between the chains that have the scale to handle the activity that's being asked of them versus the chains that the value lives on, right? You sort of have no choice but to dive deeper and deeper into wrapped assets. And so I think that there's lots of words that people use for this. Sometimes they call them layer 2s, side chains, wrappers, whatever. But I think fundamentally, I expect that Bitcoin is going to remain at the center of the crypto ecosystem, but the Bitcoin blockchain might not be the blockchain that Bitcoins usually move along.
Very interesting. It's kind of something that Stacks talks a little bit about. Sam, mentioning Solana, and obviously you have something special there, and you have your DEX serum that's built on Solana. the guys there, Anatoly and Raj, the co-founders, kind of rave about you. It's a good segue to ask about which other founders you admire in the space, because, when Jeff was mentioning all the multi-chains, each one also comes with personalities, right? You've got the Charles Hoskinsons, and you've got the Anatolys, and you've got the people behind the scenes. Who are the people that you think are getting a lot right as the space kind of grows, but also goes nuts,
Oh, it's a good question. Obviously, I think that Tully's brilliant, and I think that a lot of what drew us to Solana was that they just had they had a vision in a way that very few people did, that was really driving them forward. So I think that putting aside all disagreements, I think there have been a few platforms that have done an absolutely phenomenal job of scaling. They're not their technology, and maybe their technology, but their business. I think that Coinbase and Binance are certainly two of them, which have become absolutely massive, and really outcompeted a lot of other players in a really compelling and convincing way over the last 5 years or so. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the tone that a few people there have been setting. So I think that that's been super impressive. They're not very high profile, but a lot of the sort of Wall Street quant firms that are involved in the space have incredibly strong teams, and again, they don't necessarily talk about it, but they do have them. So that sort of is maybe another thing that I would cite there. What else? I guess and those are some of the ones I think that come to mind most. But I think that everywhere we also see a lot of really impressive people playing roles, in the ecosystem. I certainly think that as we've started to explore the venture capital space more, we've been really impressed at a lot of the people involved there, and think some of them are just really incredibly impressive people.
That's funny you bring that up, Sam. I'd like to actually ask you about that. We're heading towards wrapping this up, but I find you an interesting figure in the space because you really fly your own flag. A company I cover very closely is Coinbase, but they're very much a product of a Silicon Valley ecosystem. The sway of, Andreessen Horowitz and the kind of Coinbase ecosystem, they sort of are all very much kind of run together. They all think they're huge iconoclasts, but it's very much a kind of it's an ecosystem. So in your case, though, who are your mentors? Who, if you have any, who do you trust? Who advises you? Give us a few names of the people you think you really admire or go to for vision or help.
So, I'll give a few answers, and they're only sort of answers, but they are the truth to the extent there is an answer. The first is, there are some people who are not in the crypto ecosystem who I really admire. I think especially in the effective altruism community, there are some incredibly impressive people who I have an enormous amount of respect for, and are doing really amazing things for the world with their life. So that's sort of one answer. I think that the other thing that maybe second thing I'll say is that in general, I think that I tend to shy away a little bit from saying this is the person who is my mentor, who I get my thoughts or ideas from, or something like that, because everyone has brilliant thoughts and everyone has dumb thoughts. I have brilliant thoughts and I have dumb thoughts, and so I think that to a decent extent, when I think about what I do, it's incredibly important that I not ossify my thinking, but that I keep driving forward and I keep pushing myself. To say why do I think this? Where is this coming from? Do I really believe this is true? What are other ideas here? And And so I tend not to sort of have like that one person to identify. The last thing that I'll say is that, like, to the extent that there is someone who I'm like incredibly impressed by, I will, if possible, try to hire them. And so sometimes the answer is like, they work at FTX because I was very impressed with them.
Sam, this has been so much fun. Really appreciate the time. And I want to end on this kind of a quick, fun one that I ask a lot of people who've been in the space for a long time. And especially us. I mean, me and Jeff, we've been in this a long time. And as mainstream as it's gone, there are still obviously so many people who just kind of can't quite get there with crypto. Especially NFTs has been something that people just can't wrap their minds around. And what I want to ask you is, what's your kind of response, unless you don't bother talking to these people, but when people ask you, I'm sure you have people in your life occasionally who are like, I just don't get it all. And is it here to stay? And what do you kind of tell people who are still crypto skeptics?
Oh, I mean, I think that it's really important. I think that's a big part of the world. And yeah, you could sort of ignore it, but that, I mean, do so at your own peril, really, right? Like, so I, so I think what I'd say is, first of all, that I'm not going to come here and give you confidence that anything I say is going to be right or the right way to think about this. I think if I did, I'd be bullshitting you, right? Like, if I come here and I tell you, like, this is how it is in crypto, I don't know, stop listening to me, right? Like, because no one knows for sure what's going to happen. But I think the big thing I'd say is, like, look, like, I'm not going to take the lamest JPEG NFT that's ever been made and try and convince a skeptic that that is high art. I don't even know exactly what high art means, but like, whatever. I like, there's no point in fighting that battle, right? Like, I don't even know if I think it's meaningful, right? Like, but let's instead focus on the upside, on what this could be, acknowledging that it might never get there, and that the goal here isn't to prove that it will get here, because I certainly don't think I'm going to convince a skeptic of that. Like, my goal is to convince a skeptic that it might, that there's a world in which this becomes absolutely massive. And if I can get there, I will settle for that. And so, I think that, like, look, take NFTs, right? I think there are a lot of things that we use in everyday life which are basically NFTs. What are some examples? Well, tickets are basically NFTs. Song ownership rights, basically NFTs. I think you can look at what else is basically an NFT. I mean, video game items, basically an NFT. You guys know how much money people spend annually on video game items?
In game.
I wrote about that once. It's like 200 billion or something, isn't it?
Yeah, that's about the number. It's an absolutely spectacularly, like, colossally large amount. And so, I don't know. You think that's not going to become a big thing? Maybe it won't. I'm not going to tell you it definitely will. But, like, if you're going to tell me it definitely won't, I'm pretty happy to take the other side of that bet. Right? And like, you look at the financial infrastructure today, where you try and send money to someone. Like, have you ever tried to send money to your friend and you don't happen to both use exactly the same weird fintech app? Like, you don't happen to, like, both use Zelle or whatever as, like, your main Zelle? I don't even know what category, right? Like, it's actually, like, really hard to send, like, $20 to your brother, right? That's not trivial. And that's, like, the single easiest transfer to do in the world. Imagine trying to send money to your loved ones back home in Nigeria, and you're paying 20% and it takes a week. And it probably doesn't get stolen. Like, that's not great. And then you look at a stablecoin transfer, and it's like, I mean, on some blockchains, like, 1 second, and it costs 1/100 of a penny, and then it's there. Now, it doesn't solve the whole problem unless merchants accept it, right? If you never get that adoption, then you're not solving the hard problem of remittances with stablecoins. But if you do, if merchants start accepting stablecoins for bananas, right, then all of a sudden remittances are trivial. And so, again, maybe we never get there. I'd be sad, but it's totally plausible. But maybe we do. And that's the big thing that I would say is just like, I feel really convinced that that there's really, really high upside here.
Well, Sam, you're a trader who's made his name and a lot of money making big bets on things you think are right. So I think, I think you're probably right on the video game NFT and the remittance thing. But anyways, it's been a really fascinating conversation. You know, you have a lot of really original ideas, and thanks for being so generous with your time with us.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, guys.